In this series of videos, I'm trying to find out if video games can be used for educational purposes. And in the past few weeks, I've been doing research on whether history can be taught by video games. In my last video, I've discussed the first 4 time periods, from prehistoric times up until the end of the late Middle Ages. If you've seen that first video already, welcome back. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend watching that one before you watch this one. In that video, we've already seen that some games depict history very realistically. Whether it's about certain characters, the way the world is recreated, or the mechanics you use in the game, they try to visualize the way certain places look, or even actively try to educate people about certain time periods. On the other hand, well, we've also seen some big departures from historical accuracy, which can be attributed to stereotypes, political correctness, or sometimes it's just simply to make the game more enjoyable. Needless to say, so far a lot of things had to be taken into account while reviewing video games on their historical accuracy. But without any further delay, let's see how the rest of history is portrayed in video games, starting exactly where we left off. The late Middle Ages just came to an end. As documented by many, the feudal system started to disappear in many places, making way for more kingdoms, but also for cities with its own government. Cities therefore became more prosperous and trading became more common. This trading started to occur overseas, which ignited the start of the overseas expansion. Meanwhile, on the mainland, scientists, philosophers and artists started to question the church's rule and started looking back to the classical antiquity. The period came to be known as the Renaissance, where strategy games like the Anno series started focusing more on the expansion part. For instance, in 2009's Anno 1404, only a few games actually depict this time period. In this game, the player can make a 15th century European city, but also expand across the seas and colonize certain parts of the Orient, a generally good representation of the actual start of the colonial era. Fast forward roughly 100 years later, still during this time period and closer to what came to be known as the Renaissance, we see the world as depicted in Anno 1503. The game has a lot of similar gameplay elements and themes as the earlier mentioned 1404. Both games give the player the tools to build a colony, grow its welfare and knowledge, set out trading routes and wage war against other colonies. The big difference, of course, is the graphics, since Anno 1503 came out 7 years earlier, in 2002. As I've said before, this time period is not very well represented in video games. But apart from the Anno series, a handful of other games and franchises take a swing at depicting the Renaissance as well. Most notably, and this probably doesn't come as a surprise for people who've seen part 1, the Assassin's Creed franchise. Known by many as the Ezio trilogy, it's not 1, but 3 games set in this period of time, following main protagonist Ezio Auditore da Firenze through Renaissance Italy and 16th century Constantinople. I'll start at the beginning by saying that it's incredibly difficult to say whether an Assassin's Creed game is historically accurate or not, since most of the things you see or do are completely fictional. Instead, you'll see an enormous amount of factual characters, locations and events all mangled up in a fictional story. Therefore, the birth of Ezio in Florence in 1459, as shown in 2009's Assassin's Creed 2, is completely fictional, as well as the rest of his family. However, the story immediately gets intertwined with reality. For example, when searching through the game's database, you'll find out that Ezio has been tutored by real-life 15th century banker Giovanni Tornabuoni. Unfortunately, this is the only mention of him in the game and you can't find him anywhere else. But just like him, most characters you actually encounter in the game have really existed. This game's story is partially focused around this man, Francesco de Pazzi, who in the game is of course part of the Templar Order, but in real life actually instigated the Pazzi conspiracy, a plot by him and his family to displace this man's family, Lorenzo de' Medici, at that time rulers of the city of Florence. Throughout this game you'll encounter all sorts of characters and events that are grounded in reality, but slightly altered to fit the story of the world of Assassin's Creed. A world in which the Order of the Templar is still pulling the strings worldwide throughout history. You'll encounter real-life people like the Countess of Forli, Caterina Sforza, famous Italian captain Bartolomeo d'Alviano, diplomat, philosopher and writer Niccolo Machiavelli, And of course a Renaissance game wouldn't be complete without famous artist and inventor Leonardo da Vinci. You'll encounter these people while Ezio makes his way around several Italian cities, towns and regions. But the two cities that take center stage here are Florence and Venice. Two very important Italian cities during this time period that are very well portrayed in this game. The developers clearly did their research when building these cities. The architecture, landscapes and overall atmosphere of these cities are very accurate and pretty impressive for a game that turns 13 years old this year. Venice, with its maze-like canals and beautiful landmarks, most notably St. Mark's Basilica, feels very lively, especially halfway through the story when the game portrays Venice's annual carnival. Does that mean that everything you see is historically accurate? Well, no, of course not. Putting the whole Assassins vs Templars part aside, which obviously isn't real, some things in this game have been slightly altered, but with pretty good reasons. When taking a look at probably the most impressive structure in this game, the cathedral in Florence, better known as the Duomo, you'll see an incredible facade which unfortunately wouldn't be seen by the actual people who lived in Florence around the end of the 15th century. The facade we see in the game wasn't finished until 1876, while the real-life facade from that time looked like this. So I can see why the developers chose to go for this one and work around this inaccuracy by showing it as being still under construction. Another important inaccuracy in this game is the size and busyness of these cities. When looking at these city streets, you will encounter a lot of people, yet it doesn't even come close to the thousands of people that actually inhabited the bigger Italian cities around this time. For example, it is well documented that when the earlier mentioned Francesco de' Pazzi assassinated Lorenzo de' Medici's brother Giuliano, thousands of people were there to witness the brutal murder. Unfortunately, when Assassin's Creed 2 came out, it simply wasn't possible to portray so many people at once in a game due to hardware limitations. So here it almost looks like no one is there to witness it. Probably one of the biggest inaccuracies in the game is the connection between the de' Pazzi family and the Borgia family. In the game you'll find out that the Pazzi conspiracy was partially been realized by this man, Rodrigo Borgia, the man who would come to be known as Pope Alexander VI in 1492. He is portrayed as the overarching antagonist, using his influence as the Pope to make the Templars rule over all the major cities in Italy. In real life, none of this is true, and these two families arguably never even contacted each other. But in the game, it's a nice cliffhanger to the next installment in the franchise. 1499 would be the year in which Ezio's story continues in 2010's Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. This time the game would focus solely on the rivalry between Ezio and the Borgia family, consisting of Rodrigo Borgia, his daughter Lucrezia, and his illegitimate sons Juan, known in the game as the banker, and Cesare, main antagonist in the game. Instead of focusing on several cities, this game mostly takes place in Rome, and because of that the sheer size and attention to detail is even more impressive than it was in its predecessor. Just put the map of this game next to an actual map of 16th century Rome and you'll see how incredibly well this city is recreated. From huge structures like the Castel Sant'Angelo and the Pantheon to the still under construction Basilica of St. Peter. Even though a big part of this game is about rebuilding Rome, you'll also be able to find ruins of the old Roman Empire, like the Colosseum, Palatine Hill, the Roman Forum, and pretty much every temple you could wish for. The game even tries to teach you a thing or two about Rome's own history, with a legendary story of the 7 hills on which Romulus and Remus built Rome, and side missions called the Halls of Nero, based on the legends of Emperor Nero's Golden Palace, an emperor which we already discussed in the previous video. In my opinion, this is one of the most historically accurate cities ever depicted in video games. But yet again, a lot of liberties have been taken with historical accuracy for a lot of different reasons. In Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, when Ezio needs medicine, he can find doctors on pretty much every street corner. The fact that these doctors are everywhere is not that unfaithful, but the very well-known plague doctor uniform they wear in this game, recognizable by the beak-shaped mask, was first documented in the 17th century, nearly 100 years after this game takes place. But it's easy to see why the developers chose this very recognizable uniform in the game. Another historically inaccurate part of the game is the portrayal of its real-life characters. We see a lot of people return from the previous entry, like Machiavelli, Dalviano, Caterina Sforza, and Da Vinci gets even more attention in this game, showing not only him, but several of his inventions and paintings. But the problem isn't necessarily with these characters, it's more about Rodrigo Borgia and his family. Around the 15th century, when Rodrigo was Pope and the Borgia family was very influential in Rome, a lot of people weren't necessarily happy with his family. Because of that, rumors about the family were spreading throughout the city. Things like Cesare having a relationship with his sister, the family as a whole partaking in the abusing of their staff, and Rodrigo eventually coming to his demise not of natural causes, but by being poisoned. All of these things are actually represented in the game, which is logical since they are the antagonists. But in reality it has never been confirmed whether it's true or not, and it's probably based more on anti-Borgia propaganda from that time than on actual facts. After defeating the big evil that is the Borgia family, we don't hear a lot of Ezio for some time. It is in 1511 when we continue his story in 2011's Assassin's Creed Revelations, which takes our main protagonist to 16th century Constantinople. This city was at that point the biggest ever created in the franchise, and with good reason. Constantinople had a colorful history already at that point, starting off as a Greek city-state before changing into the Christian capital of the Byzantine Empire, the empire we've already discussed in part 1. But during this game, the Byzantine Empire no longer existed, and because of various attacks throughout the years, the now rapidly decaying city was the capital of the Ottoman Empire. Where in the two previous games the sprawling Italian cities could feel a bit lifeless and uninhabited, in this city it actually makes sense, since the earlier mentioned attacks caused the number of inhabitants to shrink down from almost 600,000 to a much smaller 100,000. But the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, who is mentioned in the game several times, insisted on revitalizing the city, inviting people from all over the world to visit the city or even stay there. That's why you can see so much variety in cultures and architecture within the game's rendition of Constantinople. Remnants of the old Greek city-states and both Christian and Muslim places of worship. Most notably the Hagia Sophia, or Hagia Sophia. A huge building which at the time the game takes place is a mosque, but was initially built as a cathedral, though this would change yet again over the years until it became a mosque once more, just 2 years ago in 2020. Sultan Mehmed II would be succeeded by his son Bayezid, but the story of Revelation takes place around the moment Bayezid steps down as a sultan, and you follow the fight between his sons Ahmed and Selim, who both want to claim the title of their father as the next sultan. Selim would eventually be the one to take the title with incredible force. As is mentioned in the game, he would murder anyone that stood in his way, and near the end of the game this would be shown when he murders his brother Ahmed. In real life his brutality would be even greater than portrayed in this game, since he murdered pretty much his entire family, including his 7 sons. The only surviving member of his family is one of his sons, Suleiman, who at that point is 17 years old. Later known as Suleiman the Great, he would become the longest reigning and most successful sultan of the Ottoman Empire. Suleiman is one of Ezio's closest allies in the game and helps him in his fight against the Templar Order, which in this game features many real-life people, mainly the earlier mentioned Ahmed, Turkish uprising leader Shakulu, but also Manuel Palaiologos, a cousin of Emperor Constantine, the final Byzantine emperor before the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Apart from this story, Assassin's Creed Revelations spends a lot of time focusing on the fictional part of Assassin's Creed's world and takes us back to the time of the Third Crusade and main protagonist of the very first Assassin's Creed game, Altair. Even though this part of the story is completely fictional, it still tries to implement many real-life elements into it. There are many mentions of famous explorer Marco Polo throughout the game, and even though you don't encounter him in this game, you will encounter his father and uncle, Niccolo and Maffeo Polo, in one of the Altair flashbacks.
Your son Marco will be eager to hear his father's wild stories.
He is a little young for such tales, but one day soon. See,
Father.
While the Ottoman Empire would slowly become one of the largest and most wealthy empires ever under the reign of Suleiman, a lot was happening on the European mainland as well. At that point, the biggest European empire was the Holy Roman Empire, an evolution of the Carolingian Empire discussed in the previous video. Even though it was huge in size, in reality it was more of a collection of smaller pieces of land looking like this. It would see its transition to the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation starting in 1519. But at the same time, there were many more powerful kingdoms and empires in Europe. But for the sake of keeping it simple, I'll just focus on the biggest ones. England, France, Spain and Portugal. But to explain the most important transition in this time period, we have to go back a few years. Where the earlier mentioned Marco Polo made his journeys mostly by land around the 13th and 14th century, traveling by sea became much more common during and around the time of the Renaissance. That's why Italian explorer Christopher Columbus set sail under the Spanish flag in 1492 to find a new sea passage to the Indian continent, only to find an entire new continent in his way. Following soon after, the Portuguese discovered the first parts of South America, while Spain also conquered more parts of mainland Europe, mainly Italy, which is why you see the Borgias, a Spanish family, in power in Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. But they also went on to conquer parts of the East Indies, the Caribbean and most of South America. They also conquered the entire west coast of the Holy Roman Empire, which they probably shouldn't have done, but more on that later. Finally, because of the Portuguese succession crisis of 1580, Philips II of Spain gained control of Portugal and therefore also all of the Portuguese colonies. Meanwhile, the British conquered all of Ireland and the French now set foot on the New World for the first time in 1605, followed soon by the British. Just like with the Carolingian Empire, this is a very important but also very complicated era in history. But also just like the Carolingian Empire, there's a very difficult and elaborate grand strategy game to explain this to you. EUROPA Universalis is widely seen as one of the best turn-based strategy games ever, with 4 installments roughly focused on the same time period, spanning from the early 15th century to the early 19th century. Because of this, it is one of the few video games that focuses on the early stages of the colonial era, and just like every other grand strategy game, it can be incredibly historically accurate. But on the other hand, this is still a video game. Some details like certain very small kingdoms are not present in the game, otherwise this already incredibly elaborate world map would become way too convoluted. Certain strategies also make it blatantly obvious that you are fighting artificial intelligence instead of actual enemies. For instance, it's highly unlikely that a smaller kingdom would attack a bigger kingdom or empire and would prefer holding out and defending themselves. In this game, as soon as a war is ignited, the enemy kingdom, no matter its size or strength, will start to attack you instead of holding out. For people who are more into adventure-oriented games, there aren't necessarily games that take place in this time period. But let's get back to the overseas expansion I talked about earlier. Apart from Spain, the French and British also started their explorational journeys over the Atlantic Ocean. The first British explorer to not just cross the Atlantic, but to circumnavigate the entire world in one voyage is Sir Francis Drake, an important character in the Uncharted series of games. Uncharted follows the adventures of main protagonist Nathan Drake in the present day, but in the first game, Uncharted Drake's Fortune, Nathan Drake retraces Sir Francis Drake's voyages in order to find the lost mythical city of El Dorado. In the third game, Drake's Deception, Nathan Drake does the same, only this time he's looking for the lost city of Ubar, also known as the Atlantis of the Sands. In real life, it has never been confirmed that neither El Dorado nor Ubar actually exist, let alone that Sir Francis Drake has ever found these cities. But you can't deny that they make a pretty cool setting for a video game. As mentioned before, Spain became incredibly powerful. Having conquered huge parts of land all around the world, nothing seemed to be able to stop their progression. That is until Philips II of Spain took over the government on the west coast of the Holy Roman Empire in 1555, known at that point as the 17 provinces or the Dutch regions. In 1566, the Spanish had ruled over these 17 provinces with an iron fist, mainly by persecuting Protestants, increasing centralization, and causing huge economic decline. This resulted in the iconoclasm, in which outraged Dutch insurgents destroyed a huge amount of Catholic churches and monasteries. It is seen by many as the start of the 80 Years' War, even though officially this conflict starts 2 years later, in 1568. An important milestone in history, not only because a small kingdom in the west of Europe decided to fight the biggest world power of that time period, but also because it eventually resulted in the splitting of the 17 provinces and the birth of the Dutch Republic. This period would become known as the Dutch Golden Age. The Dutch Republic would be the greatest economic and political power in the 17th century, becoming incredibly wealthy by means of its colonies in the East Indies, the Caribbean, India, South America, Africa, and North America. All made possible by the monopoly on overseas trade that the Dutch United East Indian Company and later the West Indian Company had, trading everything from spices and fabrics to raw materials and unfortunately also people. Now you'd think that this important period in history gets a lot of attention in video games, but unfortunately it's not even a few games that focus on this period. In fact, not a single one. The entire Dutch Golden Age is skipped. Sure, a game like Anno 1602 takes place in this time period and focuses on a European city that grows in size and wealth by means of its colonies, but it isn't specifically about the Dutch Republic or the Dutch Golden Age. There is, however, a way to get a closer look at life on the European mainland in the 17th century, with 2021's Hellish QUART. Yes, the game only depicts sword duels, but it does so in an incredibly accurate manner. Not only is this arguably the most realistic depiction of sword dueling in a video game, but the developers spend a huge amount of time to make sure that the weapons, clothing, and locations are incredibly faithful to its setting of the 17th century Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The single player is said to be firmly rooted in realities of life in the region, but that remains to be seen since it hasn't been released yet. Because of all the trading that was done overseas, a lot of money and other valuable cargo was transported by ship. This meant that near the end of the 17th century, Dutch, French and British buccaneers had a big opportunity to become incredibly wealthy by attacking these ships. It is seen as the start of yet another golden age, but this time it's the golden age of piracy. With it came the notoriety of a lot of pirate captains from this early period of piracy in the Caribbean. Which brings us to 2016's Uncharted 4: A Thief's End. Just like the other two games in the series we've discussed, it focuses on yet another fictional treasure hunt in the present day, but this time not focused on Sir Francis Drake, but on famous English pirate Henry Avery. Since it has never been confirmed where Avery eventually ended up after his years as a pirate, Uncharted 4 spins this story by saying he is the pirate that founded Libertalia, a mystical pirate colony and safe haven for him and many other pirates. But yet again, Uncharted doesn't spend too much time on reality. In real life, Libertalia would have been founded by Captain James Misson, even though scholars pretty much all agree Libertalia is a work of fiction in its entirety.
Libertalia! The long-lost legendary pirate utopia discovered after 300 years by one Samuel Drake. And his younger, slightly less charming brother who happened to be tagging along for the ride. You know, I always knew you'd make something of yourself one day.
Yeah, just so you know, it's not my first lost city.
You should just enjoy the moment.
Just like we saw with the Vikings, there aren't really any historically accurate portrayals of pirates in video games. Mostly because the most well-known images of pirates are pretty much stereotypical and based on the way they are portrayed in several other forms of media. Starting with the depiction of pirates in books like 1881's Treasure Island and 1911's Peter Pan, all the way up to movies like 2006's Pirates of the Caribbean. This stereotypical image of pirates continues in video games like Sid Meier's Pirates, the Monkey Island series, and Sea of Thieves. Maybe when the yet-to-be-released Skull and Bones finally comes out, things might change, but from what is known about the game right now, I wouldn't count on it. In real life, piracy became a bigger problem, especially because of the end of the War of the Spanish Succession. Many well-trained British privateers of the Royal Navy now found themselves in the Caribbean, without work and without income. Which brings us to a new time period. It would later be known best as a period of several revolutions, but starts with the final years of the golden age of piracy, portrayed in yet another Assassin's Creed game with 2013's Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. In this game, we follow these final years through the eyes of fictional main protagonist / anti-hero Edward Kenway. It starts around the time that countermeasures against pirates are getting more firm. That's why they, for instance, are no longer welcome on the British-controlled island of Jamaica and therefore the city of Kingston. This leads to Kenway and his group of pirate allies to found a new pirate base at the abandoned city of Nassau. We encounter many real-life pirates here, including Charles Vane, Jack Rackham, Benjamin Hornigold and Anne Bonny. But Kenway develops the strongest connection with infamous pirate Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard.
Why fly a black flag when a black beard will do?
And a younger boy named James Kidd, who eventually turns out to be famous female pirate Mary Read.
Your name's not James, is it?
The game gets a lot of things right as far as historical accuracy goes. Though it is probably still a far stretch from how everything actually took place, the overall general characteristics of each and every pirate you meet, the friendships they make, and the events that take place are mostly based on reality. Take for instance the blockade of Nassau by the Royal Navy in 1718, Blackbeard's blockade of Charlestown in the same year, and the capture of a huge Portuguese warship by arguably the most successful pirate to have ever lived, Bartholomew Roberts.
For I have dipped my hands in muddied waters, and, withdrawing them, find 'tis better to be a commander than a common man!
This all takes place in a much smaller yet very accurately portrayed version of the Caribbean. Every city you'll find has distinct characteristics and architecture that fit with who's in power there. As mentioned before, you'll see the British city of Kingston and the pirate-occupied Nassau, but also the Spanish city of Havana. Even though this game still has a lot of stereotypical aspects that we came to know of pirates, these sorts of events and locations make it a lot more believable. And even in spite of these stereotypical aspects, many people see this game as one of the most accurate portrayals of pirates ever, and there's a very good reason for it. Halfway through the game, Royal Governor of the Bahamas, Woodes Rogers, visits Nassau in order to put a stop to the pirating. He offers the pirates to return to England without consequence if they agree to end their pirating, in real life known simply as the Act of Grace, in the game known as the King's Pardon. This causes a lot of turmoil within Nassau since some pirates want to accept the King's Pardon while others refuse. The reason why this game is seen as a very accurate representation of pirate life is because, in contrast to the glorious and adventurous pirate life we often see in other forms of media, here you can see that the pirate life was far from glamorous. The choices were simple: choose the King's Pardon or meet a grim fate, whether that meant dying out at sea, in conflict or due to sickness, or being hunted by the Royal Navy to eventually be hanged or sun-dried. In this game you can see that Kenway is pretty much the only person of all of his pirate friends who eventually makes it out alive, while the real-life pirates around him all meet their real-life end. A pirate game wouldn't be complete without a big focus on naval combat, and Black Flag doesn't disappoint here. The ships you will meet at sea are exclusively sailing under the Spanish or British flag, while there were actually a lot more countries present in this area during that time. And the ships you'll encounter are more or less broad representations of the sorts of ships you would have encountered there, from little gunboats and schooners to huge man-of-wars. You can, however, find some real-life ships throughout the game. Blackbeard's ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, Stede Bonnet's sloop, the Revenge, and several warships known in this game as legendary ships like the HMS Prince, the HMS Fearless, and the HMS Royal Sovereign. The short life expectancy of pirates and growing resistance by several navies made that piracy saw its demise around 1720. But the overseas trade and colonialization kept going at an incredible pace. While Spain had lost its control over the Dutch provinces, Italy and Portugal, it still had a massive amount of colonies all over the world. Meanwhile, the Dutch Republic kept most of its colonies except for New Amsterdam, now called New York, in British hands, and the French and British were trying to get a hold on pretty much every part of land they could see in North America. Needless to say, this would become a cause for conflict. What started off as a conflict between Austria and Prussia soon exploded into a series of conflicts between several world powers spread out over Europe and many of the colonies between 1756 and 1763, better known as the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War. For England and France, this meant a conflict over the Ohio country in North America. This specific conflict is depicted in the odd one out of the Assassin's Creed franchise, 2014's Assassin's Creed Rogue. Not only a unique chapter in the franchise because it came out in the same year as another part we'll discuss later, but also because this was the first time that the fictional battle between the Assassins and Templars was depicted from the perspective of the Templars. Rogue takes place around 3 main locations. The Hudson River Valley, where both the French and British Navy are fighting for control over the sea and several colonies and fortifications. Part of the Arctic around the British colony of Newfoundland, where both navies are fighting as well. And a beautifully recreated version of the city of New York, which despite being in control of the British, still houses a lot of Dutch architecture at this point. The story sees main protagonist Shay Patrick Cormac send out to missions to assassinate several real people, like Lawrence Washington, brother of the future first president of the United States George Washington, and Connecticut politician Samuel Smith. He also works together with famous scientist, publisher and future member of the Founding Fathers, Benjamin Franklin. But Shay changes his mind about the fictional Assassin's Order after a journey to Lisbon to collect an ancient artifact unfortunately ends in him triggering the real-life 1755 Lisbon earthquake.
How could God do this to them?
God had nothing to do with this.
It's this event that makes Cormac decide to join the Templars, which house several real-life people like British Lieutenant Colonel George Monroe and famous explorer and frontiersman Christopher Gist. Both play an important role in the game. Gist becomes your quartermaster, which obviously didn't happen in real life, but the game also spends time on Monroe's real-life demise during his unsuccessful defense of Fort William Henry in 1757. Naval combat is yet again an important part of this game, the most noteworthy mission being taking control of the HMS Pembroke together with Royal Navy Captain James Cook in order to defeat the French during the siege of Louisbourg. Even though most things portrayed in the game are largely fictional, there is one very minor detail that is still worth mentioning. Throughout the world of Assassin's Creed Rogue, the player can encounter these penguin-like birds, which would be a huge oversight by the developers since penguins never lived in the Northern Hemisphere. But upon closer inspection, these aren't penguins, but actually great auks, a species of flightless bird that actually did live here but went extinct in 1844. Because this game takes place in the 18th century, they are of course still here, a nice little detail that's easily overlooked. The 7 Years' War resulted in a victory for England in the Ohio country, which meant that England took over all of the French colonies in North America. Despite this victory, the 7 Years' War counted around 1.3 million casualties, with huge losses on the British side as well. On top of that, war is expensive and the British needed to pay for it somehow. The fear of future conflict in the colonies, the increase of taxes without consulting the colonies, and the restriction of open trade in the colonies resulted in huge dissatisfaction. It meant that the 13 colonies on the east coast of North America revolted against the British in order to gain independence. It was the start of the American Revolution and the subsequent American War for Independence. A conflict depicted through the eyes of Native American Ratunaketun, or Connor, in Assassin's Creed 3. Yet again an Assassin's Creed game which depicts several events, battles and characters, all very important within the American Revolution. For example, the Boston Massacre, in which British soldiers killed several colony-born civilians. The Boston Tea Party, in which colonial insurgents, better known as patriots, dropped chests with tea in the Boston harbor as a protest against the British being able to sell tea in the colonies without paying taxes. And eventually the signing of the Declaration of Independence by several of the founding fathers, like Benjamin Franklin, John Hancock, and Samuel Adams in 1776. The game takes place on the huge widespread wilderness known as the Frontier. Of course, the city of Boston. And yet again the city of New York. Though there are a lot of similarities between New York in this game and the city in Assassin's Creed Rogue, a huge fire spread through the city on the night of September 20th, 1776, known as the Great Fire of New York. It devastated around 25% of the buildings in the western part of the island of Manhattan. Declaring independence isn't the same as actually having independence, which is why fighting continued in the colonies since it began a year earlier with the Battle of Lexington and Concord, all led by newly elected Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, George Washington. The game also depicts several of the most important battles of this war, like the Battle of Bunker Hill, the Battle of Monmouth, and the decisive victory for the Continental Army during the Battle of the Chesapeake. It all sounds like this game follows history in a pretty faithful manner, but unfortunately that is not completely true. The better half of the game is focused on an entirely fictional battle between the Assassins and Templars. Unlike many other installments in the franchise, the Assassins and Templars do not choose opposing sides within the real battles that are depicted. The Templars do not fight for the British, while the Assassins fight for the Continental Army. In fact, main protagonist Connor is discouraged to fight for the Continental Army by his mentor Achilles. Many of the Templars we see in the game actually also sided with the Continental Army. This is why many of the events in the game actually never took place. Main antagonist Charles Lee definitely wasn't a fan of George Washington, since he felt like he himself should have been made Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. And even though he was known for his ill-temperedness, critique of George Washington and overall cruelty, he did not instigate the Boston Massacre. In fact, he wasn't even in the colonies in 1773. He didn't oppose the Boston Tea Party, he actually is said to have supported it. And even though he wasn't fond of Washington, he never plotted to assassinate the future president. Historians aren't even sure if there ever was a plot to assassinate Washington. So the game isn't the best representation of how things actually took place during the American Revolution. But what we definitely can learn from this game and the other two we just discussed is that there isn't necessarily a good or a bad side within conflict. Connor sides with the Continental Army in order to protect his people, but halfway through the game he finds out that the attack that resulted in the destruction of his home and the death of his mother wasn't instigated by Charles Lee, but actually by George Washington. Sure, the Continental Army fought for independence, but that mostly meant that the white upper class in the colonies would get independence. While poor people stayed poor, slavery was still widespread and Native Americans would be driven off of their homes while the colonies spread further to the west. The grim reality starts to settle in the game's epilogue when Connor, after defeating his enemies, realizes his people still had to flee further west in order to survive attacks by the Continental Army.
Clever men, these new leaders of ours. They know not to push it just yet. Too soon for taxes. Too British.
The 1783 Treaty of Paris put an end to the war and gave the 13 states their independence, known from this point on as the United States. But while the revolution in the States just ended, a new revolution was about to start somewhere else. The French citizens were unhappy with the absolute power of King Louis XVI. The old system of government by an absolute monarch, better known as the Ancien Regime or Old System, resulted in immense social inequality, corruption in the royal family, the bankruptcy of the state, and many people being imprisoned unfairly. It all reached a boiling point in Paris in 1789, with huge amounts of riots throughout these initial weeks. It became known as the French Revolution. Though it is one of the most well-known political revolutions in history, it is depicted in only one video game, and it probably won't come as a surprise that it's yet another Assassin's Creed game. 2014's Assassin's Creed Unity. The game starts in 1776 in the Palace of Versailles, and we see our main protagonist Arnaud Dorian lose his father. And though we see these initial years of Arnaud's life take place in Versailles, most of the game takes place in Paris, starting off with Arnaud being imprisoned and sent to Paris' largest prison, the Bastille. Right in time for one of the most important events within the French Revolution, the storming of the Bastille. During all this, Arnaud befriends Pierre Belec, an assassin who was once friends with Arnaud's father, also an assassin. And of course, Arnaud decides to join the assassins as well. As you can imagine, apart from the locations and events this story takes place in, pretty much everyone you talk to, everything you see and everything you hear is completely fictional. Assassin's Creed Unity focuses less on historical accuracy within the main story and instead goes all in on the fictional battle between the assassins and Templars. But where other games in the franchise depicted real-life people within this fictional battle, most of the initial characters you'll meet in this game aren't real at all. It's in the newly introduced Paris Stories, small side quests which tells you different stories of many real-life people who actually lived through the French Revolution, where historical accuracy has a bigger presence. You'll do small chores for famous fortune teller Mademoiselle Lenormand. You'll retrieve severed heads for famous wax sculpture artist Madame Tussaud. And I probably don't have to explain to you what Monsieur Guillotine is known for. Or maybe I actually should explain, because even though the guillotine, of which you see plenty in this game, was named after this famous doctor many years after the French Revolution, he himself didn't actually invent it and instead focused mostly on healthcare and a vaccine for smallpox. That is not to say that there isn't any significant historical event within the main story though. Take for instance the execution of King Louis XVI in 1793, the secret meetings of the revolutionary political party, the Jacobin Club, and the series of killings of prisoners in Paris known as the September Massacres. But one of the most important inclusions in the main story is French statesman Maximilien Robespierre. Not only do you see his rise to fame as one of the masterminds behind the French Revolution, but also his downfall with, for instance, his failed attempt to create a new state religion during the so-called Festival of the Supreme Being in 1794, and his eventual arrest in the same year. Just like is depicted in the game, Robespierre actually did get shot in the mouth, though it isn't known whether this was self-inflicted or done by someone else. Around the same time in the game, Arnaud teams up with French General Napoleon Bonaparte. At that point not nearly as famous as he would eventually become. Despite all these events and characters, the absolute show stealer in this game is the city of Paris itself. Assassin's Creed Unity was the first game in the franchise to arrive on the at that point next generation of consoles, which initially meant a whole lot of problems. But when the game actually got fixed, it was by far the most impressive open world in the franchise yet. And honestly, I can talk for hours on end about the smallest of details you can find, like this recreation of the famous painting of the death of Jean-Paul Marat, but I'd rather focus on the city as a whole right now. Not only did the upgrade in fidelity mean that world famous buildings like the Notre Dame Cathedral would now be seen in an accurate 1:1 scale, but it also meant that the amount of NPCs shown at the same time could be increased to a massive 30,000. Remember the supposed thousands of people that witnessed the death of Giuliano de' Medici in Assassin's Creed 2? Well, these are the actual thousands of people that witnessed the execution of King Louis. This impressive upgrade in fidelity made the city feel more alive than any other part in the franchise, but also really enhanced the feeling of dissatisfaction and turmoil that prevailed during the French Revolution. It depicts the social inequality by showing you the incredible palaces of the upper class in the city, while not much further down the road you see the cramped slums inhabited by the lower class. The struggle between the two becomes especially clear halfway through the game, after the downfall of Robespierre results in a massive series of massacres and public executions, a period known as the Reign of Terror. The French Revolution caused the demise of most of France's sovereign leaders and the birth of the French Republic, a period which would only last for 12 years until the declaration of the First Empire in 1804 by a very familiar person, but we'll get there eventually. For now, the revolution saw their end, and for many countries, republics and kingdoms it became a time of progression. While the United States slowly made their way towards the West Coast, Great Britain became the center of attention for a new revolution. But that's a subject for the next video. So far, we've seen societies making cultural and scientific breakthroughs. The expansion of countries would now go worldwide, and many countries saw their most wealthy period in history as well as some of their biggest conflicts. Video games yet again do a fairly decent job of depicting all of this, though still a lot of liberties are taken with historical accuracy, for gameplay purposes, entertainment, or because a game is not just depicting history, but also paying homage to other forms of media. Some of the biggest upsides in this video are the overall characteristics of many of the real-life characters we've encountered, and the sometimes incredible attention to detail as far as these open worlds go. From the scale to the liveliness, or even just the overall immersion of these cities. On the other hand, stereotypes are still widespread, and unfortunately some important events in history are skipped entirely. Not to mention that, as you might have noticed, many time periods are pretty much only depicted within huge strategy games, much smaller indie titles, or pretty much exclusively in the Assassin's Creed franchise. As many of these franchises and their developers grow bigger, so does the urge to create a game that pleases everyone, giving less and less space to show actual historical accuracy, and instead rewriting certain events in order to appeal to a bigger audience. However, just like in the first video, we can definitely see that history had its fair share of horrible events, and war and conflict are still front and center in most parts of these time periods, and therefore in these video games. While Western countries would spread their influence throughout the world and become incredibly wealthy by means of warfare, it always came with a price for everyone involved. The next periods we'll discuss will unfortunately be no exception, and we'll see the most deadly conflicts in human history yet. But we'll also see the start of the modern world as we know it today, and the birth of what makes video games themselves even possible in the first place. But that and much more of history will be discussed in the next video. For now, thanks for watching.